Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening. We've just been so fortunate to have Joe Ellis on the show so many times in the past couple of months. It's just, I love listening to the two of you talk and pick each other's brains. And it's a great conversation this week. It was really fun because Joe took over and he said, no, I'm going to ask you questions. And he did.
He asked me about the themes of my book, Repairing Jeffersons America, and it was fun to have him be the interlocutor and me, the defensive person trying to bob and weave away from his questions. You know, it's such
Now. He was asking fair questions.
The pandemic has given us such a gift. It's given us many gifts, but the one I'm talking about now is the gift of Joseph Ellis. We've had the chance to talk with him for 6 full hours in the last month, and it's only whetted our appetite for more. You know, he's really a magisterial historian who has earned his authority on a range of questions, particularly John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, but also George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin and many others. What a privilege it is, David, for us to be able to listen to one of the supreme historians of our time, giving his time and his insights to us here on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm just thrilled.
Yeah, it was great too to have him query you about your new book and hear more about it. And you know, as you've stated many times, one of the great things about having all of this me time is the opportunity to read more, do more Jeffersonian things, garden, all that. I came across a book that I shouldn't recommend it because I'm only a bit, maybe 20% into it, but it's really interesting. Can I tell you about it?
Of course.
It's called The New Analog, Listening and Reconnecting in a Digital World by Damon Krukowski. I think that's how you say his name. And this is a really interesting book. And I'm just going to give you something from it. You know what Moore's Law is.
Oh, yes. For half the price, we double the memory every 18 months.
Something like that, right? But this author says, well, there's a reverse to that. So yes, maybe technologically we do double in our capacities and all these great things that have come of it. He's a musician and he talks about digital and analog, but the example that he used, and I'll keep this short and then we move on, but he talked about typesetting. In an analog world, you use hot lead to set type, right?
I've been there.
Yeah, something that's been around for generations and perfected and better and better. And when you print books with hot lead type, what do you get? You get absolutely perfect images of the type, and all these fonts were developed for this crystal clear. And you know what I'm talking about, you being a book lover, right?
Yes, sir.
Well, in the digital era, anybody can typeset. And what do we get? We get sort of smeared, not so good type. And, so on the one hand, technology has given us the ability for anybody to do it. On the other hand, we've lost that analog craft. And forgive me, I digress, but it was a really interesting, I thought of you often while I was reading this. You should read it. You'd enjoy it.
I will. I know you love analog. Have we lost it? Are our thoughts made mediocre by the ease with which we can all publish? Is that one of his points?
Not necessarily. His point is that technology, while it gains us much, especially in the idea that it's available to everyone, we lose something with it. And of course, music is like, you're going to find very few people that will say that records are better now than they were during the analog age at its height.
First of all, I've just looked up Moore's Law, okay? The perception that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles every 2 years, though the cost of computers is halved. So twice the oomph for half the cost every 18 months or 2 years. And, a lot of my friends who are in the industry, and particularly one of my closest friends, Douglas Holmgren, who's an X-ray laser physicist, say we're reaching the end of Moore's Law, but we never do because we find new ways, and it's just astonishing that this formulation has proved to be true again and again and again. Let me ask you this question. I know people who have these $4,000 tube type stereos and the beautiful record players, and they put down the the arm of the record player as if they're performing surgery on Mars, and then they sit back and they close their eyes and they luxuriate in the deeper, richer sound of analog. And I don't distrust this, David, not even a bit, but it seems that there's kind of a cult thing about that too.
Oh, I think there probably is. Really, when I started to think about this was years ago. I read a book by Carl Sagan called The Dragons of Eden.
Yes.
And very early on in that book, he explains analog versus digital, as I recall. We're talking about digital as numbers,
right?
And it's finite, whereas analog is infinite. It gets out there and it's so little you can't even recognize it anymore, but it goes on forever. And there is something about that. But also, and I'm showing my age, there's that thing about when you listen to vinyl LPs, you listen to a body of work as opposed to maybe
a song here and a song there. Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to maybe somebody reading your new book on an ebook and they can jump from chapter to chapter to chapter. That's not how an author intends it. An author intends the book to be read cover to cover to get the entire experience of it. And at the same time, we're getting way far away from the Jefferson Hour, but that's publishing too. It's blurbs. It's Twitter. It's not complete developed thoughts. So anyway,
I don't think we're that far from the Jefferson Hour. So one way to look at all this is that language, let's take the English language and the 26 letters that can be permutations into just such a breathtaking array of thoughts and sentences. I get on an airplane and there are 75 people reading, and no two are reading the same book. And one could be on a Sanskrit sacred text, and the other could be about how to improve your golf score. And yet they all operate by the same delivery system, which is this linear sequencing of the 26 letters of the English alphabet. It's nearly miraculous to think about. And so from one point of view, books and so on are information delivery systems. And in some ways it doesn't matter whether it's a book that was handwritten by a scribe in a medieval monastery, or if it's a book printed by Gutenberg or Caxton in the 15th, 16th centuries, or if it's something that was typed on a word processor and e-published, that they're all information delivery systems. But we all know that that's not quite true, that there's something gained and lost with the universalization of publishing, and that there's a deliberateness that we have to factor in, and a lack of it. And we have to factor in that the medium is sort of the message, that kind of glibness, the glib capacity of anybody now to have access to these tools is both opportunity and in some respects danger. These are very, very, very interesting questions. You think of Jefferson with his 7,000 volumes, and they're all expensive, and they were printed exquisitely. The paper is beautiful. He had them bound for his own preferred bindings in his own library. And today you can get on Amazon Prime or Kindle and buy a book for $4 or $14 and begin to read it immediately. And that just raises so many fascinating questions about how we deliver information and what the delivery method signifies for our capacity to take ideas and truth seriously. So I think this is sort of the heart of what we're talking about.
Right. And, it's not, I don't get the impression that this author is saying, this is a bad thing. We need to stay in the analog world.
No.
At all. He's not like a Luddite who wants to, give up digital. We'd be doomed on the Jefferson Hour if we didn't have digital.
We would be right now, at least.
Yeah, but he makes the argument, again, I haven't finished the book, but the argument is that, yes, we're going to transition to digital. Of course we want to. Look at all the advantages it provides, but it doesn't mean that analog needs to be replaced. And I take that from everything to music creation, publishing, designing cities, and it's an interesting read. I hope you get a chance to look at it.
I will.
And with that, we should probably go to the show.
It's called The New Analog, and the author is Kukowski?
The New Analog by Damon Krukowski.
So let me wrap this up and urge people to contribute to the Jefferson Hour if they like, and to become members of the 1776 Club, and to buy my new book, Repairing Jefferson's America, and to watch for the album, which is my comedy album from the Norfolk Theater, which will be out in a couple of weeks, and the online courses have filled, but the new one on Enlightenment is coming, and the summer Lewis and Clark tour is on for Montana and Idaho and so on. But let me say this, David, and I say it with the greatest seriousness. What a privilege all of this is. If you called me up on a Thursday and said, of all of the historians in America, if you could have anyone on the Jefferson Hour, who would you bring on? I would not have hesitated ever to say, there's a man named Joseph Ellis who has written a dozen of the most important books possible on the founding generation. And he's our friend. He's not only willing to come on, he's our friend. And he brings his level of humor and wryness, the dogs barking, the playfulness about his Vermont hideaway. I mean, we're so very fortunate. I hope our listeners understand
really are.
that we have the gold standard as a pal of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
How, say, Pinch, how do we get there? But you're exactly right, and I will absolutely back you up that without hesitation, I know you would have said, Joseph Ellis is the guy I want to get. And he's turned into a friend of mine. He calls me up at home and talks to me about little things in between shows. And we've never met face to face, but I feel like I've known him my whole life. He's one of those kind of guys.
Time for a field trip to Vermont.
What an incredible contribution he's made to the Jefferson Hour.
And to American history. I mean,
yes.
To everyone listening, if you have not read a book by Joseph Ellis, the place to start is Passionate Sage, Founding Brothers, Passionate Sage, The American Sphinx, His Excellency,
Revolutionary Summer.
Revolution, or Revolutionary Summer. Go for those, but do yourself the favor during this pandemic of reading Joseph Ellis books. It's like Lay's potato chips. I bet you can't stop there.
I'm on my second pass on a number of those books. I know you are too. Probably third or fourth, right?
On some of them, and of course, I have the great glory of having been noticed by him at a performance at the Athenaeum, which comes up in today's program. We need to go to the show. People should leave us their ranches and farms, their Mercedes, their BMWs, send gifts.
No. But if you do want to support the show, go to jeffersonhour.com, click on the donate button. We're really proud of the website. Our webmaster does extraordinary work on it, and it's very, very deep. There's a lot there. You can listen to the show. You can support the show. You can ask President Jefferson a question.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about all things Jefferson. And we're so pleased to have Mr. Joseph Ellis join us again this week. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And before we begin, I would like to talk a bit about books. Joseph, you've got a number of award-winning books. In fact, a Pulitzer Prize for History. You got, a National Book Award for Nonfiction in 1997.
That was for a Jefferson book, yeah, that's right.
American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, along with, I believe, an Ambassador Book Award for that. And in 2001, one of your more widely read books, you won a Pulitzer Prize for Founding Brothers.
Yeah, I mean, thank God for Founding Brothers. It sent 2 kids to college.
Your latest book, I believe, is 2018, American Dialogue, correct?
Yeah. It just came out in paperback a little while ago. It's American Dialogue. It says The Founders and Us. It's a book where I have chapters called Then and Then Now. And so normally I don't do now. I mean, I write op-eds periodically and do podcasts and stuff about ongoing American problems. But here I'm being explicit about the connection between then and now. So I take a bunch of issues, 4 of them really: race, income inequality, foreign policy, and the law. And I take Jefferson with race, and Adams and income inequality, and Madison and the law, and Washington and foreign policy, and try to see whether there's wisdom back there that can help us in our currently troubled times.
It's a great format. I enjoyed that a lot. I suspect you're working on something now.
I am. I'm back to being a straight historian. I'm working on a book on the 1770s. it'll complete a trilogy, I guess, for me, in the sense that I've been writing backwards. I started in the late 18th century and I'm moving backwards. And it's called Remembering the Cause, 1773 to 1783. It's about how we win the war and we kind of lose the peace a little bit. We fall apart. But in my quarantine, I have my work and my dogs, and I got a good wife that helps take care of things. But it's my focus up here in Vermont.
Well, I know you've read another book by a gentleman who's with us today, the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Clay's new book.
Ah, yes, it sits before me. It sits before me. Let me give you your listeners the title. It's called Repairing Jeffersons America. And then it's got the subtitle, A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship. It's by Clay S. Jenkinson, and I think it's about ready to be published, or is right now just hot off the press.
The author is with us, and he can tell us.
Welcome, Joe. I'm so glad to hear your voice again. Yes, my book, Repairing Jeffersons America, is coming out on June 1st. I'm very excited about it. It's really kind of a how-to book in that great Franklin tradition of the how-to book about how to be more Jeffersonian, how to have a garden, how to read more books, how to be more civil in your arguments, how to worship or at least revere science as our only oracle, and so on. It's about living the good life as Thomas Jefferson outlined it, but it's not just about having good wine and a nice library. It's about adopting a Jeffersonian style, a Jeffersonian approach to life.
By style, you don't mean just what kind of clothes you wear. You mean the way you think.
A way of thinking and a way of presenting yourself. Jefferson is famous for saying, we disagree, but we disagree as rational friends. Boy, that's missing in this culture. So I want to ask you a couple of questions, and
let me ask you one first.
All right.
Okay? What made you write this? Namely, you were on the road for many years as a replicator of Jefferson, probably, without much question, the world's greatest replicator of Jefferson. And we've done things together, and I did the Ken Burns series together. And at the beginning of the book I wrote on Jefferson, called American Sphinx, I begin with a presentation in Worcester, Massachusetts, where this guy Clay Jenkinson is up there looking like and dressed like Jefferson and talking. But that's been a big part of your career. To what extent is the book a distillation of your own thinking that came about not just by performing Jefferson, but by interacting with audiences and their questions about Jefferson?
Well, I'll never forget that evening at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, and I just turned up as a Jefferson pretender, not knowing that you were in the audience. I frankly didn't really know you at all at that time, and
I wasn't. I hadn't written anything on Jefferson yet. That's true, but it was a big crowd, and you were a big hit, and I was interested in the crowd. There were all kinds of real collection of different people, but when they were in the room, they were all Jeffersonian
for the moment, anyway.
I mean, much of my own insight comes from not just reading books and reading the letters of Jefferson, but interacting with students over 40 years in classrooms and listening to their responses and getting my own thinking affected by the way they respond and making me realize that there's another way to see something. To what extent did your own thinking about Jefferson evolve in a similar interaction, in this case, with a larger public?
Well, a couple of things there. One is that, it's one thing to talk about someone like Thomas Jefferson or about George Washington or John Adams. When you actually then try to talk as them, it's a really important intellectual exercise, because it's one thing for me as a scholar to say, well, here are the problems with Jefferson and slavery, or here are the weaknesses of Jefferson's foreign policy. But when you are Jefferson, of course, you have to make the case for the way you see the world. And so that enables the person doing it, the historian or the actor or whatever, to try to explore that character with all of her or his inconsistencies and quirks and perspectives and great moments and less than great moments from within. And it really brings a lot of insight. So I hope that's informed this. But I want to go back to the night at the Athenaeum. So later I see your book, and I find out that I'm in it in the preface. And here's what struck me. I didn't know whether to be deeply flattered or to hang myself, because you said, after hearing this guy I found Jefferson to be so perplexing and problematic and so inconsistent that I just had decided I had to try to wrestle the problem of Jefferson to the ground.
I don't think I quite said it that way, but I said that I was aware of his multiplicities, the way in which he's a kind of Rorschach test for people, and they read into him what they want, and he has the ability to sort of float, and you're always looking up at Jefferson. You're always looking up and aspiring to the heights that he's reached. So that in some sense, the notion of Jefferson's multiplicity is one of the themes of American Sphinx. And the term Sphinx conveys that too. You know, it wasn't you, it was the crowd's reaction to you that made me see that.
Well, so I agree with that, of course. And I'm glad for that. You know, when I'm up there performing in front of, say, several hundred people, I remember exactly that night because there were several bays and it was hard to get eye contact and so on. But when Jefferson is on, and he starts to roll out the Jefferson music about possibility and human aspiration and how America is going to be exceptionally different from everything that came before, in costume, I start to ache to live in Jefferson's America. I so want to live in Jefferson. I so want to believe he's right. I so want to believe that we can redeem the human project, that we can overcome our frailties and our whatever the reptilian parts of our brain are. You know, and he's seductive, as you know. He's an incredibly seductive person. And then you go away.
He's the kind of guy you want on the program right now.
Well, we've got you.
Well, I'm not him. That's the problem. So the part of the reason for writing this book was the kind of knowledge and the kind of impressions and the kind of conclusions you were reaching about Jefferson and yourself, really, that emerged over many years of being him, of inhabiting him. To what extent were you also motivated by being a citizen of America in the 21st century and viewing it with some degree of despair and feeling that we needed another kind of model, a Jeffersonian model, to help us move past this difficult chapter, I guess, in our lives? It says a guide to civility and enlightened citizenship, right? And why did you begin to think we needed a guide?
I'm, of course, disillusioned. And I will say, you know, I was born in 1955. I believe the United States was more enlightened in 1970 than it is today, or at least we thought we were, that we were still believing in the expansion of higher ed and that we could solve problems of poverty and that we could address questions of environment and we could expand the pie so that everyone's rights would be extended to them and protected. And there was this sense of, and I don't think this is the older man's nostalgia for his youth, but there was a sense that we were struggling, but we were still expanding the idea of America in a beautiful and earnest way. And I feel that, and I don't say this as a partisan, but beginning around 1980 with Margaret Thatcher in England and Ronald Reagan in the United States and Newt Gingrich, the pendulum has swung into a backlash and a rejection of that second American Enlightenment. And I feel disillusioned. And so that's one thing. And I quote Salman Rushdie in the introduction to the book and say, you know, he has this very savage attack in one of his novels called Fury and saying, is this what it all comes to? The Kardashians and Walmart parking lots and obesity? And was that what America really is going to be? And I don't agree with that, of course, but I see a lot of that in the culture. And that's one thing, Joe. The other thing is that, of course, it's so easy to become disillusioned with Jefferson. And of course, one is disillusioned with Jefferson. He's a racist. He's having sexual relations with a 14-year-old slave woman. He's buying and selling human beings while pretending to be above all of that. He's much more Machiavellian than he wants us to believe. He's dispossessing American Indians. And at some points during the War of 1812, saying we may have to drive them across the Rockies or worse. And so you become disillusioned with Jefferson. And so here's the question I'm trying to answer. And this really is all of our dialogues. What's left of Jefferson? Do we just put him on a shelf and say he's a period piece? He's a kind of an Enlightenment rhetorical figure, but the traction just wasn't there. And slavery is just going to eat him alive? Or do we struggle to find what's still essential and alive in the Jeffersonian? And can we get there from here? Is there a way for us to move back towards the best of the Jeffersonian spirit while cheerfully discarding those parts of him that are unresolved and no longer acceptable? I think that's the program of our time. I think that's what we have to do. I'm not going to be a Hamiltonian. I'm not going to be a believer that it's all about power. I'm not postmodern and thinking that the Enlightenment was just a set of happy-go-lucky narratives that we placed on naked power grabbing. I don't believe that for a minute. I do believe in some sense in American exceptionalism and the promise of American life, and I'm not going to give it up. But the only way to get it back, you cannot find it in the Democrat Party or the Republican Party today. It's just not there. So you have to look elsewhere. And I think we need a resurgence of the a Jeffersonian movement. And if I had as big a megaphone as you have, I might be able to help bring that about. But I'm a tiny little megaphone.
Oh, come on.
No, it's true. It's absolutely true.
Let's take a short break on that note, and we'll think about the size of each of your megaphones. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about all things Jefferson. We're joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and by the historian and author, Mr. Joseph Ellis. And when we took our break, we were discussing, well, who is more influential and how we can get back to a Jeffersonian America. Did you want to restate that question, Joe?
Yes, we were framing that question in the context of a new book that Clay is about to publish. It's due out in early June, entitled Repairing Jefferson's America, A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship. And I was asking Clay how he came to this during his career as replicator of Jefferson, and he then explained why these troubled times over the last 30 or 40 years seems to him a place that's difficult to inhabit as a Jeffersonian, and that perhaps there's wisdom back there that can help us. And I think that there are two ways of thinking about this. One way that you wouldn't like, Clay, and one way that I'm sure you would. One way is to say that Jefferson's vision is a late 18th, early 19th century American vision of the possible, and that with the arrival of urbanization and a movement from an agrarian to an industrial society, with the growth in the population from what was then 3 million to now 330 million, his values are anachronistic, and that therefore the question is, what is still living in the political philosophy of Thomas Jefferson? The answer is, well, not much. And that as a model, you might be able to pick someone more capable of being relevant to our own time. Part of me believes that. But the second way is that to think of him as somebody whose values were formed, but all the founders' values were formed in the late 18th century. And none of them believed that the truths that they were discovering, especially Jefferson, would hold true in exactly the same way for the rest of time. None of them believed that they were gods, or that tongues of fire appeared over their heads during the debate over the Declaration or the Constitution. And they all believed that, and Jefferson more than others believed that we had to make adjustments each generation. And I think that the adjustments that Jefferson would make are the most interesting of all. And in that sense, not adopting his values wholesale, but attempting to find their essence and see whether that essence in a more 21st century version is still possible. And I take it that what you're writing in Repairing Jefferson's America is an attempt to do the latter. Is that correct?
It is correct. Both of us, I think all three of us, are tempted to put Jefferson on that shelf and say that was then and this is now, and he doesn't have much to tell us. And meanwhile, he's so burdened by race and slavery that it just ain't worth it. But I don't think that's the answer. And here's why. First of all, I think that the essence of Jefferson is that humans are up to it, that humankind can improve, that education is the answer, that we will progress towards greater and greater enlightenment, and that America has a unique historical mission and a unique geographic chance of fulfilling that mission. And I think those things continue to have real power and valency in our time. And if I think about others like Madison, John Adams, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and I mean no disrespect to any of them, but they don't have the power to lift. Adams can't inspire. Madison certainly can't inspire. He's probably smarter than Jefferson. He's got a more penetrating intellect. He's more analytically solid. He understood America better, I think, than Jefferson did, but he can't lift us. And Monroe can't lift us. And J.Q. Adams can't lift us. They're all brilliant men in different ways. Monroe, perhaps the least of them, but they don't have that aspirational poetry that Jefferson has to make us want to be our best selves. And that, it seems to me, is the essence of what Jefferson offers the American experiment. Am I wrong?
No, you're not. And when you use the word poetry, it made me think, oh, this guy Jenkinson, all of his learning comes out of the literature. He was, a student of English literature. Didn't you do this?
Yes, it's on John Donne.
So your mind and your instincts are lyrical. And Jefferson is the essence of American lyricism. I once had a student at Mount Holyoke do a thesis with me called The Poetry of Revolution, Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. And that as writers, as people with the written word, were capable of expressing ideas in ways that flew, that F-L-E-W, that flew, that soared. Jefferson, among the founders, is the most lyrical, without question. And he wrote the most important words in American history, the ones that when begin we hold these truths to be self-evident. And they are the American creed. And I guess the question you're addressing here, and I will not be able to agree on all respects here, but that is the American creed still viable in the world that we're inhabiting?
I think it is, of course. I think our behavior, say, let's take an easy one, our wars in Iraq, represents some of the shabbiest of the American character, a bullying quality, a willful ignorance, the use of power over enlightenment, an arrogance about our own system and our own way of life, a willingness to just pick up and depart when the going got tough, and so on. When I look at these presidents, Joe, here are the ones that I look at. George Washington is kind of an interesting figure. I'll leave him for the moment, but Abraham Lincoln, deep aspirational, the better angels of our existence. FDR, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. We will get through this. Jack Kennedy, ask not, his sense that America has a destiny that is unfulfilled in the modern world. Ronald Reagan saying it's morning in America again, that kind of singing the song of America, that these great, great presidents, all of them, were able to sing the song of America. When's the last time you heard the song of America? You don't hear it very often anymore. We're in a disillusioned time, and I'm not willing to let that go. I think that is America, and I think we can be so much better than we are now, and I don't just mean in the Trump administration, than we are now in the second half of my lifetime. I think that we've shrugged off some of our aspirations to be the class act of the world, and we've accepted a kind of mediocrity and a kind of materialist sloth that is consuming our national ideals, and I believe that the great next president is going to be the one who can re-inspire us to try to be more than we currently are.
And what a great opportunity for the next president. I mean, in the midst of this pandemic, it's like we're hungry for that as a citizenry. I look forward to that.
I don't think either of the two candidates that will be running, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, are going to be able to provide that.
Fair enough.
And I was on a panel in Hartford, Connecticut during one of the campaigns. I guess it was 2008 or something. And the question became, one about, who possesses the most lyrical qualities or the ability to rise above it. And I found myself saying, I hadn't thought this through, but that who in his right mind wants to be president of the United States? It's a life in which you're going to leave office with less of a reputation than you entered it. And the first person to ever say that was
Jefferson.
And, your kids are going to have their whole lives with Secret Service agents around them. It's an impossible job.
Whatever you least want the world to know on the front page of the New York Times, they will know.
Right. And so it's a kind of natural selection of something other than the best. I suspect that, there are people with the potential to behave the way we would like them to in that exalted office, but that the system isn't set up to select them, and that anybody that can survive the campaign and emerge on top has to be someone who is contaminated. And And for that matter, neither Jefferson nor Adams could have ever succeeded in the current political atmosphere as a presidential candidate.
Well, and you haven't talked about that other factor, which is the corrosive power of money today, which did not exist in Jefferson's time.
Well, I know you want to ask me some questions, but this is your book, and we got to talk about it a little bit. And that is, here's a thought: to what extent is are Jefferson's values capable of being implemented in a nation that has 330 million people, that is much more biracial than Jefferson ever imagined, and so much wealth flowing around? I mean, we're almost too wealthy, but not in an evenly distributed way. But it's society so much bigger and so much more complicated than what Jefferson had to oversee as president. To what extent is it a world where those values can be implemented?
Well, it's a hard question, as you know. And Jefferson himself was an elitist. He lived on top of a mountain in a Palladian mansion, and he created all sorts of optical illusions to prevent the world from seeing how grubby his existence was in some really fundamental respects. And so that's going to be a problem, I think. I think that we have to realize that luxury, as the 18th century understood it, has poisoned us, that we just have too much stuff. We have television and 500 channels, and we've got pay-per-view of any sort that we want, and Netflix and Amazon Prime, and we have Amazon.com to send us food and tractor parts and all the books we want and anything else we have. That all the founding fathers, and your man Adams was one of them, who believed that a republic has to have a certain spareness. It has to have a Spartan feel to it, or people will just get too comfortable. And if ever there was a people in the history of the world who just, and I'm not speaking of all Americans, of course, but the great majority of Americans are far too comfortable in 18th century small R Republican terms to be able to hold this thing together. We're drunk, we're intoxicated with stuff and with overstimulations of every sort. And so the chance that we can recover, I mean, the first thing you would have to do if you were Tsar Hamilton is cut off television and blink it out once and for all that it could never come back on. And then you'd have to get people away from their devices. I mean, there's absolutely no chance that we can come back, it seems to me, from this level. The analogy to the Roman Republic fading into the Roman Empire with bread and circuses and massive corruption at the heart of the whole system, it seems to me no longer a far-fetched analogy. However, I'm not willing to give up.
There had to be a however here, yes.
I'm not willing to give up. And here's the thing, and I'm not blaming you, Joe, but you know that where we are now is that the elites have decided that they don't give a damn what happens to the rest of the country because they can't fix the rest of the country. So they're going to live in their enclaves of super enlightenment with the finest wines and the finest cheeses and the finest conversations and dinner parties. And they're going to support the Carnegie Hall series, and they're going to belong to the Athenaeum, and they're going to they're going to live like meritocrat aristocrats, and they're going to let the unwashed just wallow in their own filth. And I'm appalled by that. We have to bring everyone along.
I might have to insert an overgeneralization warning there, Clay.
No, I don't. I'm not buying it. I see these elites everywhere I travel, and they assume that they and they alone have found the elixir, and that the average person is watching professional wrestling while eating nachos.
Well, all right, let's assume the average person's not doing that. Let's assume that your goal is not unattainable. Let's assume that there is a craving for the kind of Jeffersonian values that you hold dear, and I do too. How do people get them? I mean, let's not say who should be president, but very few of us are going to be president. But that if you're an ordinary American, however described out there, and you want to try to lead a Jeffersonian life, how do you go about doing that?
That's the question of questions. I get to say the following sentence that everyone loves to say. Well, read my book. My book is a recipe for that.
Because give us a teaser so that when we are thinking about purchasing it, we know we want to purchase it because you're beginning to tell us things that will help us move in the direction that you want.
Okay, I'll give you a short list.
By direction, I mean become Jeffersonians, not just buy your book.
Turn your television off and read more books. Take walks with your friends or with yourself. Plant something, plant a garden, plant some flowers, plant an orchid. Be informed. Don't accept talking points, but be skeptical of all received points of view and doubt your own favorite prejudices and your own perspective, and reach out to people in the Republic of Letters. If there's a Joe Ellis at the other end of the country and you haven't communicated with him for a while, reach out to him and have a conversation with him, because everyone is really hungry for conversation.
I think that the internet, which is in some sense an idea that Jefferson would love,
of course,
makes it more likely we can form communities like that. I mean, I think Facebook and some of these other things, Facebook is antiquated for the younger generation, but that have become places to gather to just share your prejudices rather than to learn together. And there's a lot of nasty stuff out there, as I'm sure you know. But that at least it's potentially a means by which people can communicate together if they are already persuaded as to the direction they want to go. And I might even suggest that during this quarantine, the atmosphere in which we are living, perhaps, I mean, unless we give ourselves to television all the time, aligns more with the kind of direction you'd like to see us
I've seen
move
it in the streets. I see people out walking. I see children on bicycles and on skateboards. I see families walking around the block together. There's a way in which this enforced seclusion has thrown us out of our hectic routines, and in the enforced leisure, people are sort of recovering what is a better way of going about family life, at least, and maybe community life. I see possibility here. No one can read Bleak House today unless you make it an ordeal. But in the time of Charles Dickens, people had the leisure, at least many of them, to read long novels of the sort. Here's your chance to read War and Peace. Here's your chance to read Crime and Punishment. Here's your chance to read the complete works of Mark Twain or Emily Dickinson. So it's opportunity. But the Jeffersonian paradigm is that you have to have a Republic of Letters, and you have to seek out enlightenment, and you have to try to make yourself a better human being, both in practical terms, but also in ideological terms, in the way that you see and your perception of your civilization, and that you should be really, really, really skeptical of falling into the talking points of the party that you happen to favor. So, if you happen to be a conservative Republican, you should be very skeptical of Fox. And if you happen to be a Pelosi Democrat, you should be very skeptical of MSNBC, because nothing is worth accepting, said Diderot, that we haven't examined rigorously against our own sense of justice and of rightness and of truth. And so these are things anyone can do. We can all be more Jeffersonian if we choose to, but you can't do it unless you're committed to books, and books take time. And in our culture, which is so hectic, people don't have time to read books anymore, or don't choose to take the time to read them. And so for Jefferson, when he said, "I cannot live without books," and by the way, as you know, the thing that Jefferson and Adams really, really deeply loved and respected about each other is that they saw the world through books. And they get into this weird competition where Adams says, "Well, I just read the 26 volumes of the History of Saints." And then Jefferson's like, "Oh, brother, if I read 26 books in a year, I'm happy."
Yeah, they both talked about Thucydides and Tacitus.
And Plato, they hated Plato.
The founding is, in some ways, for the founding generation, their lodestar were the ancient Greek and Roman classics,
especially Plutarch.
And now the founders are our classics.
They're our Plutarch. We have to look to them.
That's right.
It's a good place to take a break, but we'll come back to that thought. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, another really interesting conversation with our friend Dr. Joseph Ellis at an undisclosed cabin somewhere high up in the mountains of Vermont. He claims it's a palace. I say it's a cabin. It's somewhere between the Unabomber's cabin and something that Bill Gates would have built in Vermont.
Now, just think of it as sort of Monticello.
Montezillo, we'll call it.
Montezillo, yes. That's what Adams called his place, yeah. I know you want to ask me some questions, and I promise to let you do that, but I have one more for you about your book.
All right.
One of the arguments you make in the book that I was struck by is that you say that we're no longer a republic. The Jefferson and Adams together created the first nation-sized republic. And you think that's not what we are anymore. Can you explain what you mean?
Yes. The average American has civic engagement twice per annum. They vote if there's an election, and they allow their taxes to be confiscated through withholding at the work that they do. And unless they go to the city council or the school board to whine about something, that's basically it for citizen engagement. Jefferson's going to say that's not a republic. If you have 743 military bases scattered around the world on every continent, and you have a navy that it dominates the high seas, and you become the policeman of the world, that's not a republic.
If it's not a republic, what is it?
I guess you have to call it a military
empire
internationally, and an oligarchy at home. I was about to say, if you allow money to play the role that it plays in our national civic culture, then you can't be a republic, and so on. So, okay, well, I don't mind. Yeah, okay, you can't be a republic. I think that Frederick Jackson Turner said in his famous essay on the frontier that when Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory, that was the end of the republic. And others say the Civil War was the end of the republic. And others say our entrance into the two world wars of the 20th century was the end of the republic. But the tragedy for Jefferson is that when he got the Louisiana Territory, he had a hardening of his spiritual arteries by then, and he extended slavery into the West. He should have held to his principles from 1784.
You're absolutely right, and I've written about that and agree with you completely. Res publica means public things. And it differentiates itself from a democracy. The public should be more important than the people. The public is the long-term interest of the people, which at any given moment a majority of the people might not comprehend. And the function of political leaders is to represent the public interest, even though at times it must mean that they lose the next election because they act on the basis of what they know is right for the collective. And I think that to what extent are we undergoing an experience in this quarantining again with this pandemic that forces us to behave as a collective or to recognize that there is a thing as the public, precisely because this virus affects us all, and that a libertarian perspective doesn't work now, because if you just do what you think is right for you, and that means you go out and don't wear a mask, that it affects everybody else. So that your rights have to end where the other person's rights begin. Is there the opportunity for a recovery of our original understanding of the republic more possible in this particular crisis?
I think the term you want in this situation is not republic, but commonwealth, that there's a common weal. And that
who's the guy that used the word commonwealth first just to name a state?
That would be Mr. J. Adams.
Okay, you got it. But go ahead. Yes, commonwealth.
Commonwealth means that there is a common good, and that my selfish interests cannot be allowed to get in the way of the larger entity known as the Commonwealth. And that under Republican theory, we have to discipline ourselves to see enlightened self-interest rather than naked and immediate self-interest. And it's very, very hard. It takes what the Romans called virtue with a capital V. That comes from education. That comes from groundedness. That comes from being in a community, having good manners, and understanding. There has to be a principle of mutual harmony, mutual forbearance, and mutual respect for a republic to operate.
To what extent does that depend on education? I mean, the words you're using are the words that an educated person now or then would comprehend. But to what extent is American education, especially at the grade, middle, and high school level, failing to produce civic-minded individuals or audience or people citizens because they simply haven't read the classics and they haven't read American history.
Oh, I'm with you. You know what Jefferson said late in his life? He said, alas, New England is going to lap us and outdistance us because they have two things that we don't have here in Virginia. They have the town meeting, which is actual democracy or near to it at the local level, and they have their school system. And he said, we in Virginia have neither, and they're going now to leave us in their dust unless we adopt similar institutions of commonwealth expectation.
What was the dominant reason why Virginia was declining so fast?
Slavery.
You got it. And while Jefferson wanted it to end,
he wasn't going to lift a finger to get it done.
And that's the reason he's the most resonant, resonant figure in American history. Namely, he wrote the magic words of American history about American equality, about equality and freedom. And at the same time, he embodies the original sin of American history. And he never escaped it and lived it to the end of his life.
Not only did he never escape it, but I understand that. But here's what I can't understand, Joe, that after around 1809, he stopped trying to escape it.
Yes, he did. I think Jefferson understood the depth of American racism because he was part of it. And that the notion that racism would die after slavery, or that racism is a problem that's like poison ivy and we can put it on. Jefferson knew it was a cancer, and he was living with it.
I agree with that. I think that's where I think Jefferson is still relevant, even on race, because he said this, and you tell me whether it's too easy to conclude this, but Jefferson said, emancipation is one thing. We can probably do that. But what comes after that, whether we try to live together in a biracial republic or we repatriate freed blacks somewhere else or create a homeland in Cuba or the Caribbean or the American West, he said, the real challenge is what kind of a republic can you have when the founding relationship between the two races is one of master and slave? His view was the legacy of that is going to poison everything for a very, very, very long time. And I think the jury is still a little bit out on that one.
I think it is too. And the writer who says almost exactly the same thing in modern times is James Baldwin. He said that we thought it was a challenge to come together as a people in a republic. He called it a democracy, and it was. But that's nothing compared to the challenge of assimilating and integrating blacks into that population as equal citizens. And that challenge is one that is going to be extremely difficult for us. I mean, oftentimes people who are committed to civil rights don't want you to talk about this because it sounds like you're agreeing with the racism that you're describing. What you and I are trying to say here, I believe, and I know what I'm trying to say, is that a recognition of racism's potency, the depth of its embeddedness in American society, is something that Jefferson really understood. And really, if you think about it, he said, if we really face this squarely and attempt to act on it, what's going to happen is a civil war. And he was exactly right. And 700,000 plus people had to die. And Lincoln was the guy that inherited the Jeffersonian mantle here and carrying that forward. But what we're up against on the race front is something we've certainly made enormous progress. And I don't think anybody that claims we haven't is nuts. And Martin Luther King has a monument on the mall. And I just, I was born and raised in the D.C. area, and go back to visit friends and walk by the Martin Luther King Memorial, and you look and it's King is talking to Jefferson, who's talking to Lincoln, and It's like that's the racial conversation of America. And in fact, when King made the speech, I Have a Dream speech, he made it on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, but the first sentence was, I come to collect a promissory note from Thomas that was written by Thomas Jefferson.
And this time you're going to cash the check, he said. David Swenson, point of order. May I have one?
Yes, certainly.
Joseph Ellis, we only have a few minutes left. I'm going to ask you 4 questions, and so you get 1 minute No more. I'm going to interrupt you after a minute. I know it's an impossible thing to ask a historian. In 1 minute, tell us about John Adams' role in the Boston Massacre and its aftermath.
The Boston Massacre was a mob action that the American colonists took in response to the legislation passed by England that imposed martial law on them, and that several of the Americans were killed by the British, fired upon them, and it was unclear who fired, why, whether the order was given, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that John Adams agreed to defend the British soldiers, the officers and the men, and got them all off non-guilty or with minor punishments. And it was a classic example of Adams taking the unpopular position. He wasn't siding with the British, but he was insisting that the then colony of Massachusetts is a place where British law will be enforced, and it will be enforced fairly. It's the first indication of a kind of contrarianism of Adams that I find very seductive.
Thank you. And for looking at it from the outside, one could think that could have been a career ender. It didn't turn out to be. Second question. The Declaration of Independence, in that famous letter, Adams says, well, you had to write this because you write 10 times better than I do, and you had to write this because I'm no one likes me and I'm obnoxious, and you had to write this because it had to be a Virginian. That's written much later. What's the actual answer for Adams?
It's hard to know because both of them talked about this later in their lives because it became so important as a moment in American history. At the time, they didn't know it was going to be that significant, and so there's no primary source that tells you exactly what Adams said about the Declaration. He did say that he thought the big day was not going to be the 4th, but the 2nd, when they voted on the resolution on independence, not on the draft of the Declaration. I think, though, that in the Jeffersonian view, the committee of 5 gathered. Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson were the main players, and then 2 other people, one from New York and one from Connecticut, met at Franklin's house, and that's where they agreed that Jefferson should write it. Jefferson's view is that he was always the one that was going to write it because he'd sort of been a draftsman for the Continental Congress. Adams said that they first thought of Franklin, and Franklin refused, saying he never wanted to write anything that would be edited by a committee. Adams said that they offered it to him then, and he said no, that I'm what's the word that he used?
Obnoxious, he said.
Obnoxious. I regard it as obnoxious because of the position I've taken for a year, insisting that independence was inevitable. And then Jefferson was the kind of third choice. Nobody knows what they really said.
All right, I got to interrupt you because I want to get these last 2 in quickly. So just on the Declaration of Independence, Adams thought it was a news release. He really missed it. It was going to turn out to be the most important document in American history. Third question, alien and sedition laws. In the late correspondence, Adams says, look, Jefferson, you signed the thing. You were the presiding officer in the Senate. Don't give me this thing about how this was worthy of the 9th or 10th century. You were right in there. I'm not going to take the heat on this alone. What's the truth here?
The truth is, Jefferson was vice president and oversaw the debate in the Senate on the Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were promoted by the High Federalists, the Hamiltonian Federalists in Congress, who dominated the cabinet as well. They were not Adams's appointments, or he took them on them, but that. Adams went along with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Abigail also went along with them. So did George Washington. But by the time they're writing later, it's clear that that was a huge mistake. And Adams wants Jefferson to share in the mistake, even though that's really not fair and correct. Jefferson didn't vote for them, and he simply acknowledged the Senate majority vote at the time.
Yeah, it's an Adams cheap shot late in the correspondence. Then finally, and this is a tough one, but we only have a minute. How much did Adams know about Jefferson? Jefferson wrote to William Short and said if there were one Adam and one Eve alive in every nation. He wrote radical letters to James Madison as sort of trial balloons. He wrote so many things that we know about Jefferson that make him really an incendiary in some respects, or maybe irresponsible if you want to look at it from that point of view. Adams knew some of this, but not all of this. What would he have thought if he had been privy to all of this correspondence?
Well, he would have had a harder time making the reconciliation happen. But I think that the two men bonded in 1776, and that was the bond that permitted them to come back again. And then I think it's very important that when Jefferson was moved to Paris to become the replacement for Franklin, he lived with the Adamses, he spent a lot of time with the Adams family for a full year at that time. And I think that's where, on a day-by-day basis, they came to know each other as men, and it sealed the bond that had been formed during the 76 crisis. And those were the real bonds of brotherhood that they shared for the rest of their lives.
And that's the bond that allowed them to overcome the very, very significant differences. I hear David Swenson about to say, gentlemen, we must close. I just want to say this much. Joe, it is so much more fun when I get to ask you questions. I am so much more comfortable listening to you than talking about my own little theories.
I'm happy to answer them, but I was happy to be able to ask you some, because I really want the listeners to be able to go get your book and battle with the issues. And remember, argument and dialogue is the name of the game. And we need to get out of our apps and out of our cocoons and be able to do that.
Hear, hear.
Very good. Always a pleasure to listen to the two of you talk.
David, thanks for having me again, man.
Absolutely.
Joseph Ellis, we're going to give you a little break for a couple of weeks because we know that if we talk this way, people will track you down. Mobs will find you in your...
One of the things... Clay, to what extent are you a believer in, even though it could be very difficult to influence, some form of mandatory national service?
100%, except I wouldn't make it military necessarily.
No, of course not. Of course not. All right, good. We agree on that.
Finally, we agree. But when we disagree as rational friends. You've been listening to a very interesting and special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thanks to Joseph Ellis. Thanks to David Swenson. We're doing this in a pandemic trial log, each of us in a different location. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.